It's a great opportunity for me to introduce to the Perth USAsia Centre community our newest non-resident fellow, Brad Haynes. Now, Brad, you need no introduction here in Perth in Western Australia, but given the fact that our community now extends broadly into Asia and into Washington as well, I thought I'd take just a moment to let people know who you are and what your experience is. You've got tremendous experience both in government and in the corporate sector. I think starting out in AusTrade, but then long years at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as an advisor to, and then senior advisor to former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. I think you spent some time in a small liberal arts college in Cambridge on the Cam River there, I think somewhere. But after a career in government, served for a long time in Chevron and in Rio Tinto, where we've worked very closely in the last several years. And so tremendous breadth of both public sector and private sector work. And now we're delighted to have you join us at the Perth USAsia Centre to bring that experience into our public policy community. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon. And what I would like to say is what a privilege and an honour it is to be working with you, the whole Perth USAsia Centre team, but in addition to be accorded the honour of being a fellow of this group.
Now, this conversation is an ongoing conversation. So for years in your Rio Tinto role, and many of our community will know that Rio Tinto was the foundation corporate partner of the Perth USAsia Centre. And so whether it's on our annual conferences or a lot of the work we did here in WA and in the region, we worked closely with Rio. In that case, that meant work closely with you. So I'm going to cheat a little bit on some of our previous conversations because I think they're really of interest to the community more broadly. And the first goes back to where we are today. We're into the second year of a pandemic that has kind of changed all of our lives. It's changed the way the world moves. And yet through it all, the economic engine of Australia, particularly the economic engine of Western Australia, the resource sector has moved forward remarkably. I don't know that the public really understands what a miracle that is and what it took to get that done. So I'm wondering if you might just kind of put back on the scars that you've had for the last couple of years and help us understand what was done and what was necessary to be done to keep that economic engine running when so many other sectors around the globe and so many other economies around the globe kind of shut down.
Well, great question. And I've got to say at the time, a lot of us didn't necessarily see the future as being guaranteed as positive. In fact, there was a phrase we often used when I was in my old role about chronic unease, keeps you safe, makes you plan for the future. And there was a bit of chronic unease going at the time when it first happened, because you'd look around the world and you'd see thing after thing shutting and closing down. The story of how it was done was probably a sets of multi-layered partnerships. There was certainly a partnership within the business between all of the teams on the ground in our mining footprint, the management teams that have been put in place to effectively see if we could run things safely. And there was a premium on making sure that we did everything safely and the right way, and no one would get hurt by coming to work. So that was probably the first thing. And it built a lot of understanding around it, because mining and engineering companies are good at, engineering. So they're really good at the problem-solving piece. But everyone had to be in. They had to be vested in it, because you were going to ask your team, the people that you worked with, your employees in very far-flung and difficult conditions, to take on a lot extra. So there was that commitment there that was also critical. And then the other thing that made a really big difference is, and it's overstated sometimes, but not in this case, the partnership between industry and government and a lot of our other partners made things happen. So when we talked to our vendors, they could make things happen. When we talked to the government, trying to get as much understanding of the changes that were coming our way, there was a real sense of, these are the things we need to do, and a lot of, not necessarily give and take, because it was a pandemic. We had to understand effectively what was going on, and that was probably absolutely critical. And maybe I'll give one example of how that worked. We effectively developed a series of operating procedures at each level as the government would need to escalate in response to a pandemic. And each of those gave you effectively a playbook on what you'd need to do. And that became a pretty accepted practice right across the industry. And it meant that you could deal with some of the uncertainties that were naturally going to come up. So there was clarity on what the future would be up to a certain point, i.e., if the pandemic outbreak went to this level, we needed to do these things. And each step was effectively broken down.
Well, look, people outside of WA don't necessarily realize how fortunate we've been. We've been kind of a bubble within a bubble. And I think just one case of community transmission of the virus in over a year now. I think the previous one was that one case that was announced about 2 months ago, which led to a week-long shutdown. But before that, it was April 12th. And so it's a full year, which is a stunning development in that process. But in that, there's been a lot of government restrictions on our movement intrastate and even within the state. So as someone who loves to get out into the wilds of Western Australia and camp, my first reaction in hearing about government lockdowns was, I'll just go out and camp in the bush. And then quickly found out that they were closing down all the regions. And the good thing the government did was make it quite clear the reasons why they were closing down the regions, and that we had these remote communities, Aboriginal communities without access to healthcare who were extremely vulnerable. And when articulated that way, my inability to go camping made sense, right? Yet that doesn't work for the private sector, particularly doesn't work for the resources sector, where again, if you're outside WA, you may not understand how vast the state is and how vast the distances are, but most of the mining industry management is here in WA, and yet all the work is taking place out in remote areas where those particular sensitivities are in place. So that would pose a particular challenge to the sector, is keeping local communities and remote communities safe.
It was a huge challenge and something really at the front of our mind as we sat down and started to work on what are the plans, what are the operations, how do we manage this new logistical environment. And the second is we knew we had to do it because we had to build confidence in our stakeholders and the government that the steps that we would take would be sufficient to manage the issues that they were trying to manage. Because you've got to commend the governments on what they did. The one case in almost a year is an extraordinary achievement. When you look around the world, Australian governments as a whole and the state government here have done an extraordinary job. So it was up to us as part of the process to build confidence that we were going to do things the right way. And I think that's where that partnership really came in, because there was a lot of trust developed between government and industry that we were doing the right things together and we'd get there in the end. And that way, their interventions were consistent with us being able to manage our operations, and our interventions were consistent in meeting their needs as a very responsible stakeholder on how to manage this very difficult pandemic. So that level of trust there was probably as critical as all the little technical tools that we built up.
Well, let me segue a little bit into kind of looking forward, because the lessons that you observed and were directly involved with in the sector obviously have implications beyond the resource sector, whether it's iron ore, oil and gas, etc., because they're all about some basics of safety and protocol, movement of people. And you, like me, have probably had a strange year being relatively grounded, right? After spending, the last 25 years on a plane, all of a sudden you can't go anywhere. But if you do go to the Perth airport, one of the first things you're going to see is long lines of very specific testing stations for Rio Tinto and the other companies that are operating in the regions. And my presumption is that there are probably lessons learned there for Australia. I think they've just announced that at the end of the week or the weekend, we're going to open up a bubble to New Zealand. There's already talk about bubbles with Singapore or other countries within the region that have handled this well. But I presume that the experience of our resource sector would have some applicability to how you safely open up borders and process. Is that something you've given some thought to? Are you interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good question, because the testing procedures that were put in place by the industry, Rio Tinto being one of them and one of the early movers in this space, were absolutely critical in building the confidence. They built confidence among the people actually doing the travelling, that they weren't exposed and they weren't going to be exposing anyone else. It builds confidence in that you've got an additional measure, because actually you need more than just one. You need a whole series. Effectively, what the industry had was about 5 layers of protection. Testing is a critical part of it, but that gives you a lot of transparency on what you need to know. And then the other thing changed was technology. The testing got better and better and quicker, and therefore the data that you were getting became better and better. And one of the really good things that came out of that is there were some research partnerships formed between government, industry and the major medical research entities within Western Australia to help build that knowledge. And I'm sure all of that can be pulled together and taken to the next level in the cases that you're talking about, Gordon, in terms of bubbles.
So I want to spend, I guess, one of the things I think is quite interesting is the fact that you spent, I think, was it 9 years working in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and at a very high level too. You saw kind of the policy making process, and then between Chevron and Rio, you've kind of seen the partnership there. I'm really curious as to the particular views you bring on public-private partnerships, where government works together well, where they have failed to work together well. Is there any particular themes that you can now draw as you look back on your career to date?
Well, the themes are, ones I've probably, talked with you and I about before. Partnership is critical. Sort of that level of understanding, more often than not, these gaps that form between stakeholders, whether it's industry or business, is driven by not the maximum amount of knowledge being shared between the parties. So that information sharing, that development, doing things together is the best way to build a relationship with anyone, I've found, and through that. And that certainly taught me in that instance, in my experience there. I think the other parts of it is there's a level of humility you need, that you can always learn something from someone else. And in my experience, when I was in the, senior advisor, policy level roles, I'd always learn something new when I spoke to business about the detail or level of a process. And there were a couple of examples that come to mind. One is when we were working with China to open up their economy through the WTO accession process. The discussions I had with business were absolutely critical for informing how that developed and making sure that we were getting the best possible deal. And then the other free trade agreements that we had. So if you look at the very successful Australia-US free trade agreement, a lot of the provisions are in there were actually built by the business community. So that humility piece, that trying to learn from each other, I think is absolutely critical. The other thing is when you do something together, you can do more than just by yourself. That's probably the other lesson I've learned.
I think there's a very timely example of that in the US's relatively recent vaccine successes. Right. I mean, I think I saw the news yesterday that the U.S. vaccinated 4.6 million people in a single day, which, I think, despite the news in Australia right now, our great hope right now is that the U.S. wraps up quite quickly, and then, they can take care of us with their excess, because, 4.6 million a day, we could do Australia in a week and get home for dinner on Saturday, which would be quite nice. A remarkable kind of progress. But that was only facilitated not just by the development by individual companies, but by traditional competitors like Merck and Johnson & Johnson being willing to work together to produce vaccines that weren't their own, just to get them out the door. It's a remarkable story there, I think.
That was the case for COVID here with the industry. It was probably one of the other pieces of when you look at how did the industry keep going. We shared an enormous amount of knowledge amongst each other about what was working well and what wasn't working well. I think on the vaccine piece, absolutely, that joint research. And we've seen that in other areas where that coalescence, I mean, from my other experience of this when I was in government, was some of the LNG deals that the Australian government helped support with China. And they were the first offtake agreements that were ever signed with China that were absolutely critical as part of that process of bringing everyone together and having a consolidated position.
So everything we discussed thus far has been on the relatively positive side of the ledger. There are some real sensitivities and tensions when it's dealing with government on questions of environment, sustainability, and the government regulation of that, over climate change increasingly, over historical legacy issues and those things. There are times when regulation and industry tend to be more at odds. And I'm kind of curious as to how, again, you navigate that territory in the course of your career and any lessons you've drawn through that process.
I've got to say, out of working in multiple jurisdictions right across the world, in various industry roles, there's never been a case where additional candor, detail, trying to build an understanding of exactly where you are hasn't helped in terms of a policy situation. And I think the second thing is, from an industry perspective, you're not going to get everything you want. And you shouldn't expect it, because governments have much broader sets of accountabilities and responsibilities to their citizenry. So you need to come in with that in your back of your mind. And then probably the third thing you need to do is, with those two pieces in mind, how can you still get to yes for both parties? A classic negotiation strategy. It doesn't mean you can't create value for both parties, even if the government has some very clear views on how it should approach an issue. And I've been in lots of situations where we've had those discussions and you advise the business, well, that's okay. That's their policy position and we can deal with it this way. Governments tend to respond to that pretty well and vice versa. It's probably making a call on and getting a very good understanding of what are the drivers for that policy positioning. Are they credible? Is there something they've missed? Is there something you need to take forward? The example I have there, when I was working in Chevron in Washington, DC, obviously the likely incoming Obama administration had some very, clear views on where they wanted to take the energy sector, fossil fuels, climate change. We ended up having a very strong relationship with our government, not because we're always aligned on policy, but we had a lot of clarity on where we were both going.
You've in some ways actually described our role in the think tank community, and that you focused on, I think if I recall what you said, is that there's never been a situation where, candor, additional details, and understanding exactly where you are didn't help the situation. And we had a staff meeting this morning where we're just talking about our institutional ethos. And part of that is we want to be additive, and we want to make sure that whenever we're speaking on something, we're adding context, we're adding information. There's an awful lot in our public discourse, be it political or in the media. There's just commentary. It's just sniping and snarking, which doesn't help anybody. You might get an extra click, you get my point, but you're not being helpful in that process. And we, at least in this corner of the think tank community, the Perth USAsia Centre, really want to move the ball forward, right? And that requires candor. That requires additional information. And that requires, helping people understand exactly where they are before you move forward. So I appreciate that. Those are really issues that tend to kind of overlay. We, in the think tank community more broadly, hope that in the interaction between academics and government and the private sector and the military and the scientific community, that all of our activities, whether they be conferences or seminars or workshops or conversations, they're additive in nature. It's 2 + 2 is more than 4. And therein lies the secret sauce, if you can get it out of that process. 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, we held the last of our In the Zone conferences. We were focused on critical materials, and you were kind enough to give one of the keynote speeches on that conference. Probably the largest conference ever done globally on critical materials in the past or going forward. It's not a big topic, and yet increasingly, whether it's supply chains and the security of supply chains of critical materials, recently during the pandemic, security of supply chains of medical equipment, etc. These are big interests items for government where they can't do it alone. They've got to work together with the private sector. So I wonder if you might give us a little reflection on, the integrity of and the security of supply chains, regardless of whether it's critical materials or medical equipment across the roll. And again, that government policy interaction there.
Yeah, well, the centre should be, and yourself, obviously, Gordon, should be commended for actually pulling that together as such a coherent piece of work. I think it actually had an impact on the public policy debate and the way governments thought about this issue. So I think the centre rightfully should be commended. And I was really pleased to be part of that. I guess the other element for me that comes out of that is there's actually been some significant progress. So you saw a critical minerals strategy get formed up. Yeah. Facilitation effort, prospectus. Effectively, if you want to look and see every company that's investing in future critical materials, you can go and find lists of hundreds of pieces of activity that's going on there. That level of granular detail has never been there, and I think it's building a lot of confidence in that. And the other thing that I've really seen is the research and the investment into exploration. So a lot of really good work, both for the industry, like you say, pulling in all those groups. It is all happening at once. So I expect effectively Australia to build a really significant leadership position in this area. And I'm very keen to do more work on it.
Well, one of the areas where I think we probably had the biggest impact is getting attention from a very distracted Washington, D.C. on this issue. So the fact that we had, one of the senior science advisors in the National Security Council in the White House out for that meeting with you on the dais was a helpful process. Although I would note one area where I think we probably still do a lot more is with some of our regional partners. You may recall we had an Indonesian resources minister on the program, as well as the CEO of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, Maeda Tadashi. So interesting times. Two final questions and we'll wrap up. I just mentioned Japan. Looking at the world through the perspective of the Perth USAsia Centre, we're keenly interested in the Indo-Pacific. That is obviously in both your government career and in your private sector career been very important partnerships for Australia. Can you kind of give us your view out of the Indo-Pacific? Are there particular trends or countries or developments in this region that you find important that you would like to focus on?
With Japan in particular, I think that is very much an area I'd like to focus on, and particularly because what's happened in the relationship has been so positive. When I was working for the foreign minister, we had a very strong and positive relationship, but I actually believe that's been taken to the next level. Effectively, there's been a decade of progress as effectively, to use an old Paul Keating term, ironically, enmeshment has occurred with Japan. But in addition to that, to see a much more active foreign policy being set by both countries as they look at the region. So I'm very keen to look at that. And obviously that's in a broader context of such larger shifts within the region and the role of China. The China I was working on 15 years ago in the Foreign Minister's office is a very different China to the one that's there today. There are lots of...
It's a different type of enmeshment.
Yes, absolutely. And there are positives in that as well. It doesn't come as an entirely challenging. It's like both things. You know, opportunity and challenge lives within that. And there's been extraordinary opportunity for Australia's economic prosperity out of those changes. It's not necessarily a one-way street. What it does mean, though, is clearly that dynamic is changing the way the Indo-Pacific works. It needs to be understood. But those critical relationships with South Korea, with Japan, with Indonesia, have probably gone up a notch in that period as well, and that's a very good thing.
Well, final question. There is a bit of a blank slate element about coming to a think tank, particularly given your role as a non-resident senior fellow, which means you can do whatever you want. I'm curious as to what are the issues or the trends that have kind of seized you right now? What do you want to work on? What should our audience be looking for from Brad Haynes in the coming months and year?
Well, a couple of them we've already touched on. One is those areas of cooperative policy development between industry, government and the other sectors, and how that applies to the Indo-Pacific. So that's probably one critical area. I don't want to leave critical materials behind. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space still, and the progress that's already been achieved there is something I think we need to put a bit of a lens on and have a look on that. And lastly, those bigger dynamics that we've talked about as we look across the region, because we've also got that additional piece of information there, which is a new Biden administration and their approach, which, there's some really clear strands already developing there, but they will be built on over time. And I'm very keen to dive into that and put on my old geopolitical hat, if that makes any sense, Gordon.
Well, this conversation is the Perth USAsia Centre equivalent of a sneak preview. So we're delighted, as you can see, to have Brad join us as a non-resident senior fellow. He brings such a wealth of experience. The Perth USAsia Centre was established over 8 years ago based on the premise that even here in Western Australia, that we had the critical mass of expertise in government, in the private sector, in academia, in our broader civil society as to warrant a foreign policy think tank here in WA. And it's really people like you that have helped make that true, and we're delighted to have you as a member of the team. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It's a real pleasure to be part of this and an honour.
Thank you.
Thank you.